After the divorce, everything seemed to change for her. The life she had known, the dreams she'd built with her ex-husband were now broken pieces scattered in the wind. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It felt like the end of her entire world. She had 2 young children, and the weight of responsibility sat heavily on her shoulders. She had no choice but to start over. The first task was finding a place to live. She couldn't afford anything fancy, but she needed something that would offer her family some peace. After weeks of searching, she finally found a small, modest house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The rent was cheap and the neighborhood was quiet, a good place to raise her kids away from the noise and chaos of the city. The house itself was simple: 2 small bedrooms, a cozy living room, and a kitchen that needed a bit of work. But it had a charm. There was a small garden out front, though overgrown with weeds. The backyard was spacious, with enough room for her kids to run around. It was the perfect place to start fresh, to breathe again. When she moved in, she didn't expect much. It was a small neighborhood, and there weren't many people around. The house came with a watchman, someone she barely paid attention to at first. He lived in a tiny quarters beside the entrance gate, just a small room with a bed and a table. Every time she drove past him on her way in or out, he would nod silently, a polite but distant figure who never made much of an effort to engage. She never thought much of him. To her, he was just another person doing their job. The watchman was quiet, never intrusive, and always respectful. He didn't have the air of someone important, just a simple man, probably older, who worked to keep an eye on the place. It wasn't long before she settled into her new routine. Life, though challenging, was manageable. She worked long hours at a local coffee shop, serving customers and cleaning tables. It was hard work, but it kept the bills paid. She wasn't making much, but it was enough for now. Her children, 2 little ones, both under the age of 10, were in school during the day. They didn't know how tough things had become, and she was determined to keep it that way. She didn't want them to feel the weight of her struggles. She had a lot of responsibilities, and some days it felt like too much. But she kept moving forward. There was no other choice. She would wake up before the sun, get the kids ready for school, drop them off, and then head to her job. After work, she would pick them up, make dinner, and help with homework. It was a routine, a way of life. Her evenings were the hardest. After the kids went to bed, she would sit in the small living room, exhausted, with nothing but her thoughts for company. Sometimes she would let the tears fall, but only when no one was around. She had to stay strong for them. She couldn't afford to break down. She couldn't let them see her fall apart. One evening, after a long shift at the coffee shop, she came home to find the kids asleep. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. She stood by the window for a moment, staring out into the night. It was peaceful here, a far cry from the chaos of the city. But peace came at a cost. She couldn't stop thinking about how she was barely scraping by. The bills were piling up, and there never seemed to be enough money to go around. She had no idea how long she could keep up this pace. Just then, she heard the sound of footsteps outside her window. She looked out and saw the watchman walking slowly across the yard. It was late, but he didn't seem in any hurry. He was carrying a broom and sweeping the ground in front of the gate. She watched him for a moment, wondering what his life was like. Why did he choose to live like this? Why did he stay in this quiet, forgotten corner of the world? She didn't know why, but she felt a connection to him. Maybe it was because he, too, seemed to be carrying a quiet burden, one he never spoke about. The watchman had no family that she knew of, and he lived alone. She'd seen him pass by her house many times, but their conversations had always been brief, just a polite greeting here and there. Yet there was something about him that made her feel less alone. The next day, as she was leaving for work, she saw him again, standing by the gate. This time, she took a deep breath and walked over to him. She had a feeling he wouldn't mind talking, even if just for a few minutes. "Hello," she said, offering a small smile. "You're up early today." The watchman looked at her, his eyes kind but unreadable. He nodded slowly. "Good morning," he replied, his voice quiet but steady. "Is everything all right?" she asked, noticing that he seemed a little more worn out than usual. He shrugged. "Just the usual," he said. "A lot of work to do around here." She didn't want to press too much. She knew that some people didn't like to talk about their lives, and she didn't want to make him uncomfortable. But there was something about him that made her want to know more. She wanted to understand why he seemed so content in his quiet, solitary existence. Over the next few weeks, she began to stop and chat with him whenever she saw him. She learned that his name was Mr. Patel, though everyone in the neighborhood just called him the Watchman. He had worked for the property owner for years, and his life seemed simple. He didn't have a family, at least not one that lived nearby. His days were spent watching over the property, keeping the area safe and maintaining the grounds. He rarely left the place. The more she spoke with him, the more she realized how much he seemed to care about the neighborhood. He knew everyone's names, the children's schedules, the regular visitors. He could tell if someone was out of place, and he made sure to keep an eye on things even when no one was around. It was clear that his job meant something more to him than just a paycheck. He took pride in his work, and that was something she admired. In turn, she began to open up to him. It wasn't much, but she would talk about her struggles, how hard it was to raise her kids alone, how she wished things were different. He listened attentively, never interrupting, always nodding and understanding. It was a comfort to her, having someone who would listen without judgment. One day, as she was coming home from work, she noticed that the front gate was locked. It wasn't unusual, but she was running late and didn't have time to wait. As she approached, the watchman appeared out of nowhere, unlocking the gate with a calm smile. "Sorry about the wait," he said. "I was just tidying up inside." "No problem," she replied, grateful that he had taken the time to come out. "You're always so on top of things," he nodded. "It's my job." "I try to keep things running smoothly," she smiled. "You're doing a great job." It was a small exchange, but for some reason it stuck with her. There was something about the watchman's dedication that made her feel better about her own struggles. Maybe if she too could be as steady and reliable as he was, she would find a way to make it through the tough times. But what she didn't know was that the watchman's quiet life, his dedication to his work, was just the surface of a much deeper story, one that would change everything she thought she knew about him and the life she was trying so hard to rebuild. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life continued. For her, the routines were like clockwork. Wake up, get the kids ready, drop them off at school, go to work, and return home to prepare dinner and spend time with her little ones. She didn't have much time for anything else, but in the quiet moments when the kids were asleep, her thoughts would wander back to the watchman, Mr. Patel. He was always there, standing at the gate, sweeping the yard, watching over the neighborhood. He was a constant presence, never intrusive but always aware of everything happening around him. They had exchanged more words now, mostly small talk, but each conversation felt a little deeper than the last. There was something about him that intrigued her, something beyond the silent work he did. She wanted to know more about him, about his life, but she didn't ask too many questions. She wasn't sure if he wanted to talk about himself. After all, he never really opened up. He was a man of few words, always polite but never giving too much away. Still, she felt a strange sense of comfort in his presence. There was something about the way he went about his duties, with such care and attention to detail that made her feel safer. It was as if he were watching out for her family without ever saying it out loud. One afternoon, as she was walking back home after picking up her kids from school, she saw him standing by the gate just as he always did. This time, however, he wasn't sweeping the ground or tending to the yard. Instead, he seemed to be looking out at the street, deep in thought. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach, but then decided to say hello. "Good afternoon, Mr. Patel," she called out, her voice warm. He turned and smiled, a small but genuine expression. "Good afternoon," he replied. "How are the children?" "They're good," she answered, smiling at the mention of her kids. "They're excited for the weekend. I'm just trying to keep up with them." He chuckled softly. "I can imagine. It's not easy raising children on your own." She nodded, grateful for his understanding. She didn't talk about her struggles with many people, but something about Mr. Patel made her feel like she could. His calm, steady presence was reassuring. "I never got to ask," she said. "But how long have you worked here?" He looked down for a moment as though considering the question. "It's been many years," he said quietly. "I've seen this neighborhood change a lot over the time I've been here." She smiled, trying to imagine what it must have been like. "I bet I'm still getting used to it. It's a quiet place, though, and that's what I like about it." "That's good," he said. "It's important to have peace." His words resonated with her. Peace was something she longed for, something she'd hoped to find when she moved here. Life hadn't been peaceful for a long time. But perhaps this was the beginning of something better. The next few days passed quickly, as they often did. She was busy with work, and the kids kept her occupied with their activities. But each time she passed Mr. Patel, whether on her way in or out, there was a sense of familiarity. They would exchange brief pleasantries, but it was enough. She began to look forward to seeing him, to the small conversations that brightened her day. One evening, as she was coming home from work, she noticed that Mr. Patel was sitting on a bench near the entrance, looking up at the sky. It was rare to see him sitting down. He was always on his feet, working or watching the property. She hesitated for a moment, but then decided to approach. "Everything all right?" she asked as she walked up to him. He looked up and smiled. "Just enjoying the sunset," he replied. "It's a good time to reflect," she nodded, standing beside him. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. They just watched the sky turn shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was peaceful, calming. "You know," she said after a while, "I don't get to sit down and relax much. Between work and the kids, it feels like there's always something to do." "I understand," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Life can be a constant rush. Sometimes it's good to slow down, even for a moment." She sighed, leaning back on the bench. "I try, but it's hard. I just want to give my kids a good life, you know?" He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the sky. "That's what matters. Your children are lucky to have a mother who cares so much." She smiled at his words. "Thank you, Mr. Patel. It means a lot to hear that." They sat there for a while longer, watching the night settle in. She didn't know what it was about Mr. Patel, but there was a calmness in his presence that made her feel like everything might just be okay. She didn't need anything else from him, just this quiet companionship. The next day, things took an unexpected turn. She came home from work to find a small envelope left on her doorstep. It was addressed to her in neat handwriting, but there was no return address. She opened it carefully, wondering who it could be from. Inside was a letter. The letter was short and to the point, but the message was clear. It was a note from Mr. Patel. He had written that he had noticed how hard she was working, how dedicated she was to her children, and that he wanted to offer his help. He didn't explain exactly how, but he assured her that if there was ever anything she needed, she should let him know. At first, she was taken aback. She had always appreciated his quiet support, but this was something different. It was an offer of help, an offer she wasn't sure she could accept. She didn't want to seem weak, didn't want to take charity from anyone, even someone as kind as Mr. Patel. But then, she remembered how difficult things had been. The rent was due soon, and she wasn't sure how she was going to make ends meet. Maybe, just maybe, this was the help she needed. The next time she saw him, she didn't know how to bring it up. She didn't want to seem desperate, but she also didn't want to ignore the kindness he had shown her. She found him near the gate, as usual, but this time he wasn't alone. A man in a suit was standing beside him, and they were speaking quietly. When Mr. Patel saw her approach, he excused himself from the conversation and walked over to her. "I hope you got my letter," he said, his tone kind but serious. She nodded, still unsure of what to say. "I did, thank you for writing to me. But I'm not sure." He raised a hand, stopping her before she could continue. "You don't have to explain. I can see you're doing your best. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask." She hesitated, looking into his eyes. There was something genuine about him, something that made her feel like he wasn't just offering help out of obligation. It was as if he truly cared. I may need help with the rent soon," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded as though he had expected this. "I'll make sure it's taken care of. You don't have to worry about it." She was speechless. She had never imagined someone offering such kindness, especially from someone she had hardly known. "I can't accept this," she said, shaking her head. "I don't want to take advantage of you." Mr. Patel smiled gently. "You're not taking advantage. Sometimes we all need a little help. I see how hard you work. It's the least I can do." As she stood there, still processing his offer, she realized something important. This man, who had always seemed like just a watchman, had shown more kindness and understanding than anyone else she knew. He didn't owe her anything, yet here he was, offering to help her in her time of need. For the first time in a long time, she felt a small sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The following week, she tried her best to carry on as usual, but the weight of Mr. Patel's offer lingered in the back of her mind. She hadn't expected his kindness. It had come out of nowhere, and it left her feeling both grateful and conflicted. She wasn't used to asking for help, and it made her feel vulnerable, something she was desperately trying to avoid. But as the days passed, she realized just how much she needed that help, especially with rent due soon. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she was fooling herself. Why shouldn't she accept his offer? She wasn't asking for a handout. She was simply accepting a gesture of kindness from someone who clearly cared. He had seen her struggle, and he wanted to help. It wasn't charity, it was support. Still, she didn't want to come across as weak or desperate. So, she kept her distance for a few days, focusing on work and her kids, avoiding any conversations that might make her feel uncomfortable. She wasn't sure if she was ready to accept Mr. Patel's help, or if she ever would be. But it didn't take long for her to realize that avoiding him wasn't the answer. The next time she came home, she saw him standing by the gate again, just as he always did. This time there was something different in his posture. He wasn't just standing there as he usually did, doing his job. He was waiting for her. She hesitated, but then walked over to him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what to say, but she couldn't ignore him any longer. "Hi, Mr. Patel." She greeted him, her voice a little unsure. He looked at her, his expression soft. "Good evening. I was hoping to talk to you." She nodded, feeling a bit nervous. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Mr. Patel looked at her for a moment, his eyes kind but serious. "I know you've been trying to do everything on your own, but sometimes it's okay to let others help. You don't have to carry everything alone." She felt a lump form in her throat. His words hit a nerve. She had been carrying everything on her own for so long, too long, and it was exhausting. But she didn't want to admit it. "Not to him, not to anyone. I know," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's just hard to accept help. I don't want to feel like I'm burdening anyone." "You're not a burden," he said quietly. "You're doing the best you can, and that's all anyone can ask for. It's not about weakness, it's about accepting help when it's offered." His calm demeanor was comforting, and she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a while. She wanted to let go of her pride and accept his offer. She knew she needed to, but still a small voice inside her hesitated. "I don't want to owe anyone," she said softly. "I've always taken care of myself and my kids. I've had to. I don't want to be in anyone's debt." Mr. Patel smiled, his eyes warm. "It's not about owing. It's about kindness. Sometimes people offer help not because they feel obligated, but because they genuinely care. You've shown strength by taking care of your family. Don't be afraid to let others care for you too." She looked at him, trying to process his words. He was right. There was no shame in accepting help from someone who genuinely wanted to offer it. It didn't make her weak, it made her human. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "I don't want to take advantage of your kindness." "You're not taking advantage," he said firmly. "You're allowing me to be kind. And that's all." For a moment there was silence between them. She could feel the weight of the decision in her chest. But there was something in his words that made her feel less alone, less like an outsider in her own life. Maybe, just maybe, she could let her guard down and accept his help. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "I'll accept your help." "Thank you." Mr. Patel nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's no trouble. I'm happy to help." She felt a rush of relief wash over her. It wasn't the answer she had expected to find, but it was the right one. She had made the right choice, both for herself and for her children. She wasn't alone in this. There were people who cared, people who were willing to lend a hand when needed. Over the next few days, life began to feel a little easier. The weight of worrying about rent wasn't hanging over her every waking moment. She could focus on the things that mattered: her kids, her work, her future. The pressure had lessened, and with it, she found herself smiling more, laughing with her children, and feeling a small flicker of hope for the first time in a long while. But that wasn't the only change that was taking place. As the days passed, she began to notice something strange about Mr. Patel. He was always polite, always calm, but there was an air of mystery about him that she couldn't quite figure out. He had told her about his work and his life, but there was something he wasn't saying, a depth to him that remained hidden behind his quiet demeanor. One evening, as she was walking home from work, she noticed that Mr. Patel wasn't at his usual post by the gate. She thought nothing of it at first, assuming he was simply taking a break. But as she got closer, she saw him standing by the back of the house talking to a man in a suit. They were speaking in low voices and she couldn't make out the conversation, but there was something about it that caught her attention. The man looked familiar, but she couldn't place him. Curious, she walked a little closer, trying to be discreet. She didn't want to intrude on their conversation, but something about it felt important. The man in the suit looked agitated, and Mr. Patel, usually calm and composed, seemed to be responding with a hint of urgency. The conversation ended abruptly, and the man in the suit walked away, his footsteps echoing in the quiet evening. Mr. Patel stood there for a moment, his back to her, before he turned and walked back toward the gate. She wanted to ask him what had just happened, but something told her it wasn't the right time. She didn't want to pry into his life, but the encounter left her with more questions than answers. Who was the man in the suit? Why had they been talking so seriously? And why had Mr. Patel seemed so different in that moment? The next few days passed uneventfully, but the memory of that conversation stuck with her. She didn't bring it up to him, not wanting to make things awkward, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mr. Patel than he was letting on. He had already shown her kindness, and now she couldn't help but wonder what secrets he might be hiding. It wasn't long before she learned just how deep those secrets ran. One afternoon, a few days after the mysterious conversation, she received a call from the property manager. She had expected it to be about the rent, but what she heard instead took her by surprise. "Good afternoon," the manager said, his voice professional but urgent. "I need to inform you that there will be a meeting with all the tenants tomorrow evening. It's important that you attend." She was confused. A meeting? With the tenants? She had never been invited to one before. But before she could ask for more details, the manager hung up. The next evening, she walked to the community hall, unsure of what to expect. When she arrived, she saw all the tenants gathered in a small room. At the front, standing tall and composed, was Mr. Patel. But this time, he wasn't the quiet watchman. He was the owner of the entire property. The man who had been standing by the gate offering kind words and support was also the one who owned everything she had been living in. She felt a rush of confusion, followed by a wave of realization. The man she had been speaking to, the man who had offered her help, was not just a simple watchman. He was someone far more influential, far more important than she had ever imagined. And in that moment, she understood. She had been living under the watch of someone who wasn't just keeping an eye on the property. He was keeping an eye on her. The meeting was set up quickly, and as she walked into the small community hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. The room was filled with other tenants, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. No one knew why they had been called together, and the atmosphere was thick with unspoken questions. At the front of the room, standing tall and composed, was Mr. Patel. He looked different now, not just the quiet watchman, but someone who commanded attention. His presence had changed, and it unsettled her. As she took a seat among the others, she noticed the way the other tenants looked at him. There was a respect in their eyes, a recognition she hadn't seen before. It was clear that they knew him in a way she didn't. But why had he invited them all here? And why now? Mr. Patel stepped forward, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the tension in the room. He looked around at everyone, his eyes scanning the crowd before he began to speak. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he said, his voice steady. "I know many of you are wondering why we're here, so I'll get straight to the point." There was a pause, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something personal, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "As you all know," he continued, "I am the owner of this property. I've been managing it for many years, but I've kept my involvement largely behind the scenes. I don't usually interact much with the tenants, as I prefer to let the management handle things. But lately I've been rethinking that approach. There are some changes that need to be made, and I want to be more involved in the community here." The room was silent, and she could feel the eyes of the other tenants on him, waiting for more. He paused again, his hands clasped in front of him as he looked down for a moment. "First, I want to apologize for not being more present. I know there have been concerns about maintenance, communication, and certain other issues around here. I take full responsibility for that. I've made a decision to be more hands-on moving forward. You will all see more of me around here from now on." His words were met with a mixture of surprise and murmurs of approval. It was clear that many of the tenants had been waiting for this moment, for someone to step up and take charge. But as Mr. Patel spoke, she couldn't help but feel that there was more to this announcement than he was letting on. He was always so composed, but tonight he seemed different. There was a subtle tension in his posture, an unease that he wasn't showing on the outside but that she could sense. It was as if he were keeping something from them, something important. "I also want to address the issue of rent increases," he said, his voice firm but measured. "I know many of you are struggling, especially with the current state of things. As a result, I've decided that for the next 6 months there will be no rent increases. I want to give everyone some time to adjust, to get back on their feet." Her heart skipped a beat. The offer was generous, unexpectedly so. She knew how hard it was to make ends meet, how little room there was to breathe when rent was a constant pressure. The thought of not having to worry about a rent increase for the next 6 months felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. She glanced around the room and saw that others were equally relieved. The atmosphere seemed to shift, as if a collective sigh of relief had been released, but even as she felt grateful, there was still that nagging feeling inside her. What had prompted Mr. Patel to make such an offer? What was he expecting in return? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his actions than just generosity. As the meeting continued, she found herself tuning out the rest of the details. She was lost in her thoughts, trying to make sense of what was happening. Mr. Patel had always been kind, but this was something entirely different. It was too much, too sudden. Why was he offering all of this? What was his true agenda? The meeting finally came to an end, and as the tenants began to file out, she lingered behind. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say to him, but she knew she needed to talk to him. She needed to understand. As the last tenant left, she stood up and approached him. He turned to her as she walked toward him, his expression neutral, though there was something in his eyes that made her pause. He was waiting for her. "Mr. Patel," she began, her voice hesitant. "Can I speak to you for a moment?" He nodded, his gaze steady. Of course. The room had emptied, leaving just the two of them standing there. She felt an odd sense of discomfort, as if the walls around her were closing in. She wasn't used to feeling vulnerable, but here, now, she did. She needed to know more about him, about his motivations, his intentions. "I just wanted to thank you for what you're doing," she said, her voice soft. "It's a relief to know that we won't have to worry about rent increases for a while." "I don't think anyone expected that." Mr. Patel nodded, acknowledging her words. "I know it's been difficult for everyone, especially in these times. It's the least I can do." She hesitated, then spoke again, her words careful. "But Mr. Patel, I can't help but wonder why you're doing all this. I mean, it's not like you've been very involved before. Why now?" His gaze softened, and for a moment he looked almost tired. It was a brief flicker, but she caught it. She could sense that there was more beneath the surface. "You're right," he said, his voice quieter now. "I've kept to myself for a long time. It's easier that way, I suppose. But lately I've realized that I can't keep hiding. There are things I need to make right, things I've neglected." She waited for him to continue, but he didn't speak for a long moment. When he finally did, his words were heavy, as though he had been carrying a burden for a long time. "I've made mistakes," he said slowly, "and I need to do better. I can't fix everything, but I can start with this." His words caught her off guard. There was a rawness in his voice, an honesty she hadn't expected. She had always known him as the quiet, reserved watchman, the man who kept to himself. But now he was letting her see another side of him, the side that carried regret, the side that felt the weight of his past decisions. "What do you mean?" she asked gently. "What mistakes?" He sighed, his eyes turning away for a moment as though he couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. "It's not something I like to talk about, but I've spent a long time focusing on my business, my wealth, and I've ignored the people around me. I've missed the opportunity to make a real difference in the lives of those who matter, and that's something I can't undo." She didn't know what to say to that. She had never expected this conversation to take such a turn. She had always seen Mr. Patel as a quiet, distant figure, someone who lived his life on the periphery. But now she was beginning to understand that there was more to him than she had ever imagined. He wasn't just a watchman, and he wasn't just a businessman. He was a man carrying the weight of his choices, trying to make things right. "I didn't mean to make things difficult for you," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to be anything other than what I've always been. But I'm trying. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability he had always kept hidden behind his quiet demeanor. For the first time, she felt like she was seeing the real Mr. Patel, the man behind the mask. And in that moment, something shifted between them. The connection they had begun to form deepened, and she realized that they were both just people, trying to make their way in the world, struggling to do their best. She didn't know where this would go or what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so alone. Days turned into weeks, and life began to settle into a new rhythm for the single mom. The relief from the rent freeze allowed her to breathe a little easier, but there was something else, something she hadn't anticipated. Her thoughts, which had always been consumed with work, bills, and her children, now often drifted back to Mr. Patel. The man who had been nothing, more than a quiet watchman at the gate, was becoming someone she thought about, more than she cared to admit. They continued to talk every now and then, small exchanges of pleasantries or brief words of encouragement. At first, it had been hard to accept his kindness, but the more they spoke, the more she found herself grateful for his presence. It was more than just his help. It was the way he made her feel heard. In a world where she had been shouldering everything on her own, he was a small but steady source of support. It wasn't just the rent freeze that had made things easier, though. There was something about him, his quiet strength, his calm assurance, that had started to soften her resolve. He had shown her a kindness she hadn't expected, and slowly, over time, that kindness was beginning to change her own perspective on life. She had started to open up more, not just to him, but to herself. There were still challenges ahead, but for the first time she wasn't facing them alone. One afternoon, as she was returning from the grocery store, she saw Mr. Patel standing by the gate again. But this time he wasn't alone. There was another man with him, someone she didn't recognize. The man was dressed sharply in a suit, and they seemed to be in deep conversation. She wasn't sure what was going on, but the sight of Mr. Patel talking to someone so formal made her feel like she was seeing a side of him she had never known. Curiosity tugged at her, but she didn't want to intrude. As she walked closer to the gate, she made a point to smile and nod in Mr. Patel's direction, hoping to greet him without interrupting. But when Mr. Patel saw her, he waved her over, his usual calm smile replaced by an almost excited expression. The man in the suit looked over at her and nodded politely, but his gaze was more distant, as though he didn't know her well. She stepped up to the gate, unsure of what was happening, but sensing it might be important. "Good afternoon," she said, keeping her voice warm but cautious. "Good afternoon," Mr. Patel replied, his eyes lighting up. "I'd like you to meet someone." The man in the suit extended his hand to her. "Hello," he said with a businesslike smile. "I'm Mr. Sharma. I work with Mr. Patel on the business side of things. We've been discussing some future plans." She shook his hand, still uncertain about what was going on. "It's nice to meet you," she said politely. Mr. Patel seemed to sense her confusion. "I'm sorry if this feels abrupt," he said, his tone apologetic. "I know you've probably been wondering about some of the things I've been doing. Mr. Sharma and I have been working on something that will benefit everyone here. I wanted to bring you in on the conversation." She blinked, surprised. "What kind of plans?" Mr. Patel glanced at Mr. Sharma before continuing. "We've been looking at ways to improve the living conditions here for everyone. There's been a lot of work that needs to be done, repairs, upgrades, things that have been neglected for too long. But we're also looking at how we can help the people who live here, tenants like you, get more involved in the community. It's about making sure this is a place where people not only live but thrive." She was still processing everything he was saying. It felt like everything had shifted since the first time she moved in. The quiet, solitary watchman was now standing at the forefront of a much larger project, one that involved real change. She could sense the sincerity in his words, but she also couldn't help but wonder why he was telling her this now. "That sounds good," she said cautiously, unsure of what else to say. "But what do you need from me?" Mr. Patel smiled as though he had been waiting for that question. "I'd like you to be involved. You've been a part of this community, and I respect how hard you've worked to keep things together. I think you could help us shape these changes." The offer caught her off guard. She had never imagined that her involvement would extend beyond being just another tenant. "I'm not sure how much help I could be," she said, feeling a little out of place. I'm just trying to manage everything as best I can. You'd be surprised, he said. Sometimes the people who are closest to the issues have the best ideas for change. I'd like to get your input and maybe even your help in bringing some of these ideas to life. It's not just about fixing things physically. It's about fixing the way we connect, the way we live together. It's about building a community. She thought about it for a moment. It was true. She had been living here for a while, and she had seen what worked and what didn't. She'd been witness to the struggles of her neighbors, and she knew how little was being done to address those struggles. Mr. Patel's offer wasn't just an invitation. It was an opportunity to be part of something bigger than herself. But could she really do it? I'll think about it, she said, her mind already running through the possibilities. She wasn't sure if she was ready to take on such a big responsibility, but the thought of being part of something meaningful, of helping others like her, was tempting. Take your time, Mr. Patel said. I'll be here if you have any questions. And just know whatever you decide, I'm grateful for your honesty and for everything you've done so far. As she walked away from the gate, her mind was swirling. She had no idea what the future held, but one thing was clear. Things were changing. And whether she chose to be a part of that change or not, there was no denying that she had come a long way from where she had started. That evening, after putting the kids to bed, she sat down with a cup of tea and reflected on everything that had happened over the past few months. She thought about how much had changed since the day she first moved in. At the time, she had been just another single mom, struggling to find her footing. But now she was part of something more. She had made connections, found unexpected support, and learned to let others in. And then there was Mr. Patel. The quiet man who had been standing at the gate, watching over the property, had turned out to be someone far more complex than she had ever imagined. He wasn't just the watchman. He was a man with a past, a man who had been trying to make up for his mistakes, a man who genuinely wanted to make a difference. She couldn't help but admire him. But more than that, she had come to realize that they had something in common. They were both trying to rebuild, trying to move forward from past mistakes. He had found a way to do that, to take responsibility and create change, and maybe, just maybe, she could do the same. The next day she went to Mr. Patel and told him she was ready to be involved. She didn't have all the answers and she didn't know exactly how she could help. But she was ready to try. She had spent so long trying to do everything on her own, but now she understood that sometimes it was okay to lean on others, and that was what Mr. Patel was offering, to help her stand up, to be a part of something better. Together they started making plans not just for the building but for the future of the community. She didn't know where it would go, but for the first time in a long while she was filled with hope. Hope for her family, for her neighbors, and for herself. She wasn't alone anymore. The days after her decision to get involved were a blur. She found herself meeting with Mr. Patel more often, discussing plans for the property, the tenants, and the changes they wanted to implement. It was hard to believe how far things had come. When she first moved in, her thoughts had been consumed with simply surviving, getting by day. But now she was part of something bigger. She was helping shape the future of the place she called home. Mr. Patel was a steady presence. He guided the conversations with a calm, thoughtful approach, always listening more than he spoke. It was clear to her now that his quiet nature wasn't a sign of disinterest, but of someone who was always paying attention, always thinking, always planning. She admired that about him. Together they began outlining ideas for community events, making a list of repairs that needed to be addressed, and talking to the other tenants to get their feedback. She was surprised at how open the other tenants were. People who had once been distant, who had kept to themselves, were now talking about things they needed, things that mattered to them. The building, which had once felt like a collection of isolated lives, was starting to feel like a community again. One afternoon, as they sat together in the small office Mr. Patel had set up, she asked him a question she had been wondering about for a while. "Mr. Patel," she began, her voice gentle, "why did you really offer to help me that day? I know it wasn't just because you saw I needed help with the rent. There had to be more to it." Mr. Patel looked at her, his expression softening. He didn't answer right away, as though he was carefully choosing his words. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I suppose it's time I tell you the truth," he said quietly. "When I first saw you here, I didn't know much about you. But I saw a woman who was doing everything on her own, Raising children, working long hours, managing it all. And I knew what that was like. I knew what it was like to struggle, to feel like no one was looking out for you. But I also knew that you didn't need just help with the rent. You needed more than that. You needed someone who would see you, who would notice what you were going through. I think in a way I wanted to offer you that. She listened, her heart softening at his words. There was something vulnerable about him in that moment, something that made her see him in a new light. She hadn't expected him to open up so much. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I didn't realize that. I didn't realize how much you understood." Mr. Patel smiled faintly. "I suppose I've been through my own share of struggles. But seeing people like you, people who just keep pushing forward even when the world seems heavy, I wanted to do something for you. I know how hard it can be. Sometimes it's the smallest things that make a big difference." They sat in silence for a while, each of them reflecting on the path that had led them to this point. For her, it was a reminder that kindness could come from the most unexpected places. For him, it seemed like a step toward healing, toward righting the wrongs of the past. As the weeks passed, the community started to take shape. Mr. Patel's decision to freeze the rent for 6 months allowed many tenants to finally get ahead on their bills. People began to engage with one another more, offering help where they could. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other were now sharing stories and ideas. There was an energy that hadn't been there before, a sense of togetherness that was slowly growing, like a spark catching fire. One day, as she was walking back from a meeting with some of the other tenants, she bumped into Mr. Patel near the gate. He was carrying a stack of papers, and as usual, he looked calm and composed. "Hello," she said, smiling as she walked up to him. "I've just been talking with a few people about the next steps for the repairs. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but things are looking good." Mr. Patel nodded. "Yes, we do. But I'm glad to see the progress. You've done a lot for this place. I'm glad you've decided to be a part of this." She smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I never thought I would be doing something like this, but it's been rewarding. It feels good to be part of something that's making a difference." He looked at her for a moment, and for the first time she saw something more in his eyes, something deeper. "You've done more than you realize," he said quietly. "You've helped bring this community together. You've made it feel like a place where people care about each other." She blushed slightly, not used to being praised. "It's been a team effort," she said. "I couldn't have done it without everyone else. We all have a role to play." He nodded, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made her pause. "It's not just about the community," he said. "You've made a difference in my life, too." Her heart skipped a beat, but before she could respond, the moment was broken by the sound of a car approaching. Mr. Patel quickly shifted his attention to the car, his face returning to its usual calm expression. She watched him for a moment, a sense of confusion and warmth swirling in her chest. She wasn't sure what to make of his words, but there was no denying that things between them had changed. What started as a simple gesture of help had grown into something much more, something neither of them had anticipated. As the days went by, their relationship continued to evolve. There were still meetings to attend, repairs to organize, and plans to discuss, but now there was also a growing connection between them, a bond that was becoming more difficult to ignore. She found herself thinking about him more than she had before, and not just in terms of their work together. There was something about him, something that pulled at her heart, but she wasn't sure how to approach it. She had been so focused on surviving, on keeping everything together for her children, that she hadn't allowed herself to think about her own needs. Now with Mr. Patel, she found herself wondering if she was ready to open up to the possibility of something more. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she found herself standing by the gate again. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the buildings. She hadn't planned to stay out so late, but something about the quietness of the evening made her want to linger. As she stood there, she saw Mr. Patel approaching from the distance. He was walking slowly, his hands in his pockets, his face thoughtful. He didn't seem to notice her at first, but as he got closer, he looked up and smiled. "Good evening," he said, his voice warm. "Good evening," she replied, her heart racing slightly. They stood there in silence for a moment, watching the sunset together. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, like two people who had shared a journey and now found solace in each other's presence. I never thought I'd be standing here like this, she said softly, breaking the silence. Mr. Patel glanced at her, his expression soft. Standing where? Here with you, she said, her words coming out more honestly than she had intended. I didn't think I'd be involved in this community, let alone be a part of something so meaningful. He nodded. Neither did I, but sometimes life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes we find ourselves exactly where we need to be. She looked at him, meeting his gaze for the first time in a way that felt different, more open, more vulnerable. And in that moment she realized that things between them had changed. They weren't just two people working on a project anymore. There was something deeper, a connection that neither of them had expected but that both of them were beginning to feel. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time she felt like everything might just be okay.